Royal Guard loses control. After security forces Princess Charlotte to undress completely. Princess Charlotte lived a life most people could only dream of. Born into royalty, she was the daughter of a respected and powerful family. Every day, she woke up in a grand palace with beautiful gardens and views that stretched for miles. Her world was one of luxury and privilege. It seemed like nothing could touch her, nothing could break through the walls that protected her. But despite the lavish surroundings and the adoration of the public, there was always an undercurrent of tension in her life. Her family was constantly surrounded by security, and for good reason. Royalty, especially in times of political unrest, is often a target. For Princess Charlotte, security wasn't just a part of her life, it was a constant presence. Every moment of her day was planned, guarded, and protected. There were guards watching every door, cameras in every hallway, and personnel making sure no one could get close. It was a life that few could relate to, and even fewer could understand. Though she grew up surrounded by wealth, Charlotte never took it for granted. She was often reminded by her parents that privilege came with responsibility. Every public appearance she made, every event she attended, was carefully monitored. Her every move was analyzed, and every decision she made could impact the reputation of the entire royal family. While other young girls might dream of a life of ease, Charlotte knew that her life was different. There were constant reminders that the world she lived in was a world of scrutiny and public expectation. Despite the constant attention, there were moments when Charlotte felt like any other girl. She would visit the gardens of the palace or spend time with her friends, enjoying simple pleasures. But even these moments weren't without their precautions. Every event, every outing, was surrounded by the watchful eyes of her family's security team. Every step she took was guided, not just by the safety of her own home, but by the need to maintain the public image of her family. On the day that would change everything, Charlotte had a similar plan. It was another public event, another engagement that required her presence. It was something she was used to. The public had been waiting for this moment for months, and the media was already buzzing about the princess's appearance. The event was supposed to be nothing out of the ordinary. Charlotte had been preparing for days, going through the motions of what was required. She had been briefed on the schedule, the details of her outfit, and the arrangements for her security. As always, the royal team had meticulously planned every aspect of her day. The royal guards, the most trusted members of the family's security, were already in place. They were there to make sure everything went smoothly. But even with the highest level of preparation, nothing could have prepared them for what was about to unfold. As the day arrived, Charlotte got ready with the same calm she always had before an event. She dressed in the outfit chosen by her advisors, a beautiful dress that would impress both the public and the media. Her hair was carefully styled, her makeup applied with precision. It was a routine she had come to know well, and it had become second nature to her. But as she made her way out of the palace and into the waiting car, something felt different. The air felt heavier than usual. The hum of the crowds outside the palace walls seemed louder, and the atmosphere more tense. Her security team was even more on edge than usual. Charlotte couldn't help but notice that something wasn't right, though she couldn't put her finger on it. The security personnel were moving with a sense of urgency she had never seen before. It was only when they arrived at the location of the event that things began to feel truly strange. Normally, Charlotte would have entered the venue with the usual fanfare, greeted by the crowd, and escorted by her security team into the safety of the building. But this time, the atmosphere inside was thick with uncertainty. The usual smooth operations were disrupted, and the security guards seemed to be acting differently. There was an unsettling murmur of whispers among the security team. The tension was palpable. Charlotte, though composed, could sense that something was off. The usual calm of the situation had been replaced with an edge of anxiety that lingered in the air. She tried to ignore the unease, but it followed her, like a shadow that she couldn't escape. As she walked through the halls of the venue, she was greeted by the usual respectful nods and smiles. But behind the politeness, she could feel the uncertainty in the eyes of the security team. Something wasn't right, and Charlotte couldn't shake the feeling that it was all about to change. It wasn't long before the cause of the tension became clear. There was a breach in security. A situation had unfolded that no one had expected, and it was clear that the danger was real. The very thing that the royal family had worked so hard to avoid had come to their doorstep. The safety of the princess was compromised. The event was immediately put on hold as the security team rushed into action. Charlotte was quickly escorted to a more secure area, away from the public eye. The panic in the air was palpable. The security personnel were acting on instinct now, trying to contain the situation and ensure that the princess remained safe. But in their haste to respond, the situation quickly spiraled out of control. What had been a well-organized, carefully planned day had suddenly become chaotic, and that was when the orders came. The princess was to be immediately and thoroughly checked. It was a standard procedure in cases of potential threats, but the way it was handled was far from normal. Security protocols, designed to ensure the safety of the royal family, were put into motion. But what happened next would change everything for Princess Charlotte. In the frenzy of the situation, the guards acted under the orders of higher authorities. And it was in that moment, under intense pressure, that the orders took a drastic turn. The princess, in a panic-stricken situation where no one seemed to have full control, was ordered to follow the strictest measures for her safety. What followed was something that Charlotte would never forget. As the scene unfolded, it became clear that this was no longer just about safety. It had become something more, something far more personal. What had begun as a routine event for the princess had spiraled into a crisis that would forever alter her view of the world she lived in. The scene in the venue quickly became one of confusion and uncertainty. As Charlotte was escorted through the hallways by her security team, she could sense the rising tension around her. Normally, these types of public appearances were smooth, with careful planning to make sure everything went off without a hitch. But this time, something had gone terribly wrong. The air was thick with anxiety, and the whispers among the security team only seemed to make things worse. Charlotte, usually composed and confident in public, began to feel a strange weight on her shoulders. It was as if she was being watched from every angle. The security team was acting differently today, more alert, more cautious. She could see the worry in their eyes as they checked and rechecked every corner, making sure everything was in order. But nothing could prepare them for what was about to unfold. Moments earlier, everything seemed normal. The event was going as planned, and the media had already gathered in anticipation. The crowds outside the venue buzzed with excitement, awaiting the arrival of the princess. Inside, the atmosphere was controlled and polished, as it always was during royal events. But then, without warning, something triggered a security alert, and suddenly everything shifted. The atmosphere in the building was no longer one of celebration, but of fear. The first sign of trouble was a sudden disturbance near the entrance. Security personnel rushed to the scene, exchanging hushed words and quick glances. The usual calm had turned into an anxious energy that Charlotte couldn't ignore. Something had happened. The threat wasn't clear, but it was enough to set off the alarms and put everyone on edge. Charlotte's security team, who were always ready for any potential danger, now moved with a sense of urgency she had never seen before. Normally, they would escort her through the event, ensuring her safety while allowing her to engage with the public. But today was different. They moved swiftly, surrounding her, almost as if they were shielding her from something they couldn't quite explain. As the security team continued to assess the situation, the princess felt an unsettling feeling wash over her. She had always trusted her team, believed in their professionalism, and had never questioned their ability to keep her safe. But now, she couldn't help but wonder if they were truly prepared for whatever was unfolding. The usual procedures they followed now seemed inadequate, and she felt a growing sense of vulnerability. The security personnel quickly ushered her away from the public eye, moving her to a more secure location. She couldn't see the full picture, but she could sense the chaos around her. She could hear the distant sounds of hurried footsteps, the sharp commands from her security detail, and the nervous murmur of voices. It was as if the world she had always known was slipping away. Charlotte's mind raced as she was taken to a private room away from the public. The door closed behind her with a soft thud, and she found herself standing in the middle of the room, unsure of what was happening. The familiar walls of the royal building, which had always felt like a fortress, now seemed to close in on her. She was safe, yes, but the sense of security she had taken for granted had been shattered. The minutes that followed felt like hours. Her security team was busy on the phone, making calls to higher-ups, trying to assess the situation. But there was no clear answer, no explanation for the chaos that had erupted in the venue. All Charlotte could do was wait. She could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on her, each passing second adding to the growing tension in the room. She glanced around the room, trying to focus on something familiar. There were no windows to look out of, no easy escape from the situation. All she could do was sit there, surrounded by her security, waiting for a resolution that felt further away with each passing minute. Her thoughts were clouded with questions. What had gone wrong? Who or what had caused the disturbance? And most importantly, was she truly safe? It wasn't long before the higher authorities in charge of her security began to issue orders. The situation was more serious than they had initially anticipated. Though no one knew exactly what had happened, it was clear that the breach was something to be taken very seriously. The atmosphere grew even more tense as security personnel moved in and out of the room, their expressions grim and determined. Then, to Charlotte's surprise, the orders that came next were unlike anything she had ever experienced before. In an effort to ensure her absolute safety, the highest levels of security insisted on an immediate and thorough search. It was a standard procedure in high-risk situations, but in Charlotte's case, it would go much further than she had ever imagined. The request was not just for a simple check, but a complete search to make sure there were no hidden threats. The request was, understandably, met with hesitation. Charlotte's guards had always been by her side, protecting her privacy and dignity. They were trained to uphold the highest level of respect for the royal family. But now, with the stakes so high, the protocols they followed had to be followed to the letter. There was no room for mistakes, no time to waste. The idea of a full, personal security check wasn't new. It was something that happened in extreme cases, but it was always a carefully controlled process. For Charlotte, however, it felt like a betrayal of the trust she had placed in her security team. It wasn't just about safety anymore, it had become about control. And in that moment, control was slipping from her grasp. As the orders were given, the tension in the room heightened. Charlotte could sense the unease in the eyes of the guards around her. They were loyal, but this situation was unlike anything they had been trained for. They were acting under instructions from higher-ups, but it didn't make the process any easier. Charlotte, too, was struggling. She felt a deep sense of vulnerability, something she had never experienced in all her years surrounded by protection. The guards, who had always been her protectors, were now caught in a difficult position. They were under orders to act swiftly, to ensure that every potential threat was neutralized. But the reality of what they were being asked to do weighed heavily on them. They had spent years keeping Charlotte safe, but now they were being asked to cross a line that felt too personal. They had always respected her privacy, but now, in the name of safety, that boundary was being broken. It was a strange moment, one that Charlotte would never forget. It wasn't just about the security threat anymore. It was about the loss of control, the feeling that her life was no longer her own. The situation was spiraling, and Charlotte, for the first time, felt truly powerless. The tension in the room became unbearable. Charlotte was not only dealing with the security threat, but with the violation of her own privacy. The discomfort was palpable. She had never imagined that a day meant to be a simple public appearance could turn into something so invasive. She was left wondering, how had it come to this? And more importantly, would she ever feel truly safe again? The atmosphere inside the room was tense. Charlotte, still sitting in the same place, could feel the weight of the situation closing in on her. Her mind raced as she tried to process everything that had happened, but it felt as if everything around her was moving too fast for her to catch up. There was an unsettling silence in the room, broken only by the sound of footsteps rushing back and forth, and the occasional murmur of her security team speaking into their radios. She had always trusted her security personnel, admired their professionalism, and believed that nothing could break the wall of protection around her. But now, for the first time, Charlotte felt the cracks in that wall. The breach in security had shaken her, but what followed, the orders she had been given, was something she had never anticipated. What had once been an orderly and controlled life now seemed like a fragile house of cards, teetering on the edge of collapse. Charlotte's thoughts were interrupted by the soft murmur of voices just outside the room. She could hear snippets of conversation, but none of it made sense. They were discussing something, but the details were unclear. All she could make out were a few words, phrases that only added to her growing sense of confusion. But one thing was certain, things were getting more serious. One of the guards finally stepped into the room, his face grim and tense. His eyes met hers, and for a moment the world seemed to slow down. Charlotte could see the concern in his gaze, and it was clear that he was struggling with what was happening. He wasn't just her protector anymore. He was caught in a dilemma that neither of them had expected. He seemed to be wrestling with his own sense of duty versus the responsibility of ensuring her privacy. The guard spoke in a quiet tone, explaining that the orders from higher up had become more intense. There was no room for mistakes now. They needed to ensure that there were no hidden threats, nothing left to chance. But Charlotte felt a deep unease at the words he said. The realization that her life, her safety, was now in the hands of people who had been forced to act so quickly unsettled her. She knew this was standard procedure when dealing with security threats, but somehow it felt different. There was no denying that she was still a princess, a member of the royal family, but in that moment she felt like just another person caught up in a system that had lost control. Everything she had once thought of as sacred, the trust between her and her security, the careful balance of her public and private life, was now in question. The weight of it all felt unbearable. The guard, seeing her distress, tried to reassure her, but his words felt hollow. He explained that the situation was being handled with the utmost care and professionalism. But Charlotte could tell that even he was shaken. He, too, was caught between the conflicting demands of his duty. He had always been her protector, but today he felt as though he had failed in some way. The unease in his eyes was unmistakable. He, like everyone else, was not prepared for this. As the minutes ticked by, Charlotte's mind began to spiral. The royal family was no stranger to threats, and she had always known that being in the public eye meant constant vigilance. But this was different. The events that had unfolded were not part of the usual threats she had been trained to deal with. This was something else, something personal, something that felt like an invasion of her very being. She could feel her breath quicken as the weight of the situation settled over her. This wasn't just about a security breach anymore. It was about her privacy, her sense of control, and her dignity. Everything that had once felt so certain in her life was now in jeopardy. The realization that her entire world could be turned upside down in an instant was both frightening and overwhelming. She had never felt so vulnerable, so exposed. Her thoughts were interrupted again as another guard entered the room. This one was carrying a tablet, its screen glowing in the dim light. The guard's expression was even more serious than the others. He didn't speak right away, instead handing the tablet to the first guard, who took it with a solemn nod. Charlotte couldn't make out the details, but the look on their faces was enough to tell her that the situation was escalating. They were receiving new information, orders, and updates from higher up. But instead of reassuring her, it only seemed to add to her unease. The room was becoming a blur of activity, with more guards coming and going, checking and double-checking every detail. Charlotte had always been accustomed to the hustle and bustle of royal life, but today felt different. Today, it felt like chaos. The one structured world she had known seemed to be falling apart, piece by piece, as she sat there, unable to do anything. For what felt like an eternity, Charlotte remained in the room, her mind racing with thoughts and emotions. Her life had always been carefully orchestrated, planned out, protected, controlled. But now she realized all of that control had slipped away. She had no choice but to sit there, waiting for answers she wasn't sure would ever come. And then, as though to remind her of the gravity of the situation, a senior officer entered the room. His expression was grave, and Charlotte could tell that whatever had been happening outside was now coming to a head. He walked toward her with measured steps, his eyes briefly meeting hers. It was clear that he had come to deliver a message, but the tension in the room made it feel like anything but a simple conversation. He explained the next steps that needed to be taken, and Charlotte listened in silence. The decision had already been made. The security team, in their heightened state of alert, was being forced to follow strict protocols, regardless of the personal cost. They had to act quickly, thoroughly, and without hesitation. But as the officer spoke, Charlotte could feel her heart sink. This wasn't just about a security check anymore. This was about her life, her privacy, and the way the world saw her. And in that moment, she felt like nothing more than a pawn in a game much larger than herself. The officer's words rang in her ears as he finished explaining what would happen next. Charlotte was about to experience something she never thought she would, something that would change her perception of everything she had once known. The decision had been made, and she had no choice but to follow through. She had been prepared for royal duties, for the public's gaze, and for the weight of responsibility that came with being part of the royal family. But she had never imagined that the day would come when she would have to face a situation like this, where the very fabric of her life would be torn apart by forces beyond her control. The world outside may have been unaware of the tension that had built up in the venue, but inside the room, the gravity of the situation was all too real. Charlotte knew that nothing would be the same after today. Her life, the world she had always known, was shifting in ways she couldn't have predicted. And as the moments ticked by, she could only wonder what would come next. The minutes stretched into what felt like hours as Charlotte waited in the secure room. It was as if time had slowed down, and all she could do was sit there, trapped in her own thoughts. The chaos that had erupted in the venue earlier was still fresh in her mind, and she couldn't shake the feeling that everything had changed. Her security team was still in motion, with guards rushing in and out, whispering orders into radios and phones. They were trying their best to maintain control, but Charlotte could sense the cracks in their confidence. The door to the room opened again, and this time it wasn't one of the usual guards. It was a higher-ranking officer, someone who rarely came into direct contact with her. His face was solemn, his expression unreadable, but his presence alone was enough to make Charlotte's heart race. She could see that the situation had escalated beyond what anyone had expected. The officer stepped forward, his footsteps deliberate and heavy. Charlotte braced herself for what he was about to say, but she couldn't have prepared herself for the weight of his words. He began by explaining that the security breach earlier had been more serious than anyone had anticipated. There was a threat, though the details were still being sorted out. What mattered now, however, was that the royal family's safety had been compromised in a way they hadn't experienced in years. The gravity of the situation hit Charlotte like a wave. It wasn't just about a routine security check anymore. It was about something much bigger, something that would alter her life forever. The officer's voice was calm, but Charlotte could hear the tension in it. It was a tension she recognized, one that came with the realization that control had been lost. They were doing everything they could to restore order, but the damage had already been done. The public event was now canceled, and the royal family was in lockdown, ensuring no further threats could harm them. Charlotte listened quietly, her mind still reeling from the events of the day. She had never been in a situation like this before. The media had always been a part of her life, of course, but they had never invaded her personal space in such an invasive way. Now, her life felt like it was spiraling out of her control. She wasn't just worried about the immediate threat. She was worried about what the public would think. What would they say about her? How would the world react to this breach in her safety? Would she be seen as weak, unable to protect herself and her family? The officer continued, explaining that they had taken immediate action to tighten security measures, but the damage to the royal family's reputation was already done. News outlets were already picking up on the story, and it wouldn't be long before it reached the public. The media would twist the details, speculating and exaggerating in ways that were beyond their control. It was something Charlotte had grown up with, an unavoidable side of being a member of the royal family. But now it felt different. It felt personal. This wasn't just another story for the tabloids to chew on. It was a reflection of her life, her safety, and her dignity. As the officer spoke, Charlotte's thoughts shifted from worry about the immediate danger to concern over the lasting impact this incident would have on her and her family. The royal image, carefully curated over the years, had always been a symbol of strength, unity, and control. But now that image had been shattered. The public would question everything. Were the royal family's security measures truly as tight as they had been led to believe? Was the system failing them? And worse still, would this event lead to more threats, more invasions of privacy? Her mind raced with these questions, but there was little time to dwell on them. The officer's next words snapped her back to the present. He informed her that they had already begun the process of investigating the breach. They were going over every detail, trying to piece together what had happened and how they could prevent it from happening again. Charlotte's security team was working around the clock, coordinating with other royal families and international authorities to ensure that the threat was neutralized. But despite the officer's assurances, Charlotte couldn't help but feel a sense of helplessness. She had always been the one who felt safe behind the walls of her family's palace. It had been a place of refuge, a place where she could escape the constant public scrutiny and be herself. Now, even those walls seemed to have been breached. The walls of her privacy, her safety, and her control were crumbling. What was once an impregnable fortress now felt fragile, vulnerable to forces beyond her control. The officer left the room after a brief exchange, his presence no longer offering the comfort it once might have. Charlotte sat in the quiet, her thoughts spinning. She couldn't help but feel like a prisoner in her own life. She had everything, luxury, privilege, respect, but it all seemed hollow now. What was the point of all the riches and attention if it couldn't protect her from something as simple as a breach of security? Was her life always going to be dictated by the whims of others, by forces she couldn't see or understand? Her feelings of vulnerability only deepened as more details emerged. The media, as expected, wasted no time in turning the incident into a scandal. Reports were already circulating that the royal family had been caught off guard by the security breach, and speculations about the true nature of the threat were running wild. Some outlets were suggesting that the breach was more than just a random act. They hinted at deeper conspiracies, pointing to the possibility of insider involvement. The stories were sensational, designed to grab attention, but they only added to the chaos. Charlotte could do nothing but wait for the storm to pass, but the storm felt endless. The palace had become a place of tension, where every phone call was about security, every conversation centered on damage control. Charlotte could no longer escape the reality of her situation. The public's fascination with her life had turned from admiration to scrutiny, and the weight of it was unbearable. As the days passed, the media continued to speculate and twist the narrative. Each new report seemed more exaggerated than the last, and Charlotte felt her sense of control slipping further away. She had always known that being in the public eye came with a price, but she had never imagined that price would be so high. The personal violation she felt from the breach of her privacy was something she would never fully recover from. And yet, despite everything, Charlotte knew she had to remain strong. She had to face the world with the same dignity that had always been expected of her. The royal family's reputation was built on resilience, and Charlotte knew that if she was going to reclaim her sense of self, she had to rise above the chaos. But how could she do that when everything she had known and trusted had been turned upside down? In the weeks that followed, the royal family began to rebuild their image, but it would never be the same. The event had left a permanent mark on Charlotte, a scar that would take time to heal. The princess, once seen as a symbol of strength and grace, now had to navigate a world that no longer felt safe or predictable. But one thing was certain. No matter how much the media and the public tried to define her, Charlotte would find a way to reclaim her life. She would face the challenges ahead with the same determination that had gotten her this far. It was a new chapter, one that she hadn't asked for, but one that she would have to write herself. In the weeks following the incident, the royal family's world was in turmoil. What had once been an orderly, carefully controlled existence was now fractured. Charlotte, once able to rely on the comfort of her protected life, found herself constantly watching over her shoulder, uncertain of what the next moment might bring. The breach in security that had threatened her life also threatened the royal family's carefully curated image. What was meant to be a smooth and peaceful life was now something they had to fight to protect. Charlotte spent much of the following days in seclusion, surrounded by her family and a team of advisors who were working tirelessly to repair the damage to their reputation. The media frenzy was relentless, and it seemed as though every news outlet was eager to get their hands on the next big scoop about the royal family. There were constant calls from the press, each one trying to get a glimpse of the princess's thoughts or capture a photo that might sell more stories. But Charlotte wasn't ready to face the world just yet. In the midst of all the chaos, she realized that the most important thing was not the public opinion, but her own sense of safety and peace. She couldn't let the fear and uncertainty consume her. It would be a long road, but she knew that she had to find a way to regain control over her life, to rebuild the trust that had been shattered, not just with the public but with herself. While the royal advisors were doing everything they could to manage the public narrative, Charlotte took the time to reflect on her own personal journey. She realized that she had been living in the shadow of her title for most of her life, bound by the expectations of others. She had always been a symbol of strength, but the events that had unfolded made her realize that strength wasn't just about appearances. It wasn't about hiding behind a polished image or following protocols. It was about facing the truth, no matter how uncomfortable it was. Her feelings of vulnerability had opened her eyes to a new reality. She could no longer ignore the cracks in the facade of her life. But instead of letting those cracks define her, she decided to use them to build a stronger foundation. The world may have seen her as a princess, but she had come to understand that she was also just a person who had faced an unimaginable challenge and come through it with a new sense of purpose. As she worked through her emotions, Charlotte began to realize that this was a turning point in her life. She could choose to retreat into the shadows and allow the weight of the public's judgment to consume her, or she could take charge of her own destiny and reshape her image on her own terms. For the first time in a long while, she felt the freedom to make her own choices, to define who she was, not by what others expected of her, but by her own standards. The royal family's efforts to regain control over the narrative continued, but it wasn't just about restoring their public image anymore. It was about reclaiming their dignity and their privacy. Charlotte, in particular, had learned a hard lesson about what it meant to live under constant scrutiny. She had never realized just how fragile her sense of security had been until it was ripped away from her. Now she was determined to ensure that her life, whatever it would look like going forward, would be lived with purpose and integrity. Charlotte's family, while supportive, had their own struggles to contend with. The scandal had put them all under a microscope. They, too, had to navigate the complicated world of public perception while trying to protect their loved ones. In the face of these challenges, Charlotte's relationship with her family grew even stronger. They leaned on each other for support, understanding that this was a test not just of their resilience, but of their unity. As the months passed, the royal family began to recover from the public scandal. The media frenzy eventually settled down, as it always did. But the effects of the incident remained with Charlotte. The vulnerability she had felt in the aftermath of the breach would never be fully erased. It had changed her in ways she hadn't anticipated. She was no longer the carefree young woman who could walk through life unburdened by the weight of the world's eyes on her. Now, she was more cautious, more aware of the realities of living in the public eye. But despite the challenges, Charlotte found strength in the lessons she had learned. She no longer took her safety, her privacy, or her peace of mind for granted. She understood now, more than ever, that the world could change in an instant, and sometimes, the only thing you could control was your own response. The security breach that had once felt like an insurmountable obstacle was now a part of her story, a chapter that she could look back on with pride, knowing that she had faced it head-on. Over time, Charlotte became more involved in the work of reforming the royal security protocols. She worked closely with her advisors, helping to implement new strategies and ensure that the royal family's safety was taken more seriously than ever before. She also became an advocate for privacy, understanding firsthand how valuable it was to maintain a sense of personal space in a world that was constantly watching. She spoke out about the importance of finding a balance between the public's right to know and an individual's right to privacy. Her journey of recovery wasn't easy, and it wasn't quick. There were setbacks along the way, moments when she felt overwhelmed by the pressure of being in the public eye again. But each step forward, no matter how small, helped her rebuild her confidence and her sense of self. Charlotte had learned that strength didn't come from avoiding challenges. It came from facing them, learning from them, and using them as stepping stones toward growth. The royal family's public image slowly recovered, but Charlotte was no longer concerned with the opinions of others. She had come to understand that her worth was not defined by what the media said about her, nor was it determined by the expectations of her royal duties. Her worth came from within, from the strength she had found in herself, and from the love and support of her family. As time went on, Charlotte found new ways to use her platform for good. She began to speak out on issues that mattered to her, using her voice to raise awareness for causes she believed in. She worked closely with charities, focusing on the mental health of young people and advocating for better access to health care. She used her position not just for the sake of appearances, but to make a real difference in the world. Though the incident had shaken her to her core, it had also opened her eyes to a new understanding of herself and the world around her. Charlotte was no longer just a figurehead, a symbol of the royal family. She was a woman who had faced hardship, who had grown from it, and who was determined to move forward with strength and integrity. The princess who had once felt trapped by her title now felt free to define her own life, to write her own story, and to embrace the future with hope and courage.